There are some things you don't forget. The smell of snow on a cold night, the sound of gravel under your shoes, and the image of your daughter-in-law crouched on a concrete step in 30-degree weather while 20 feet away through a lit window, your son's family laughed around a dinner table like nothing in the world was wrong. That image is burned into me. I will carry it to my grave, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it really started. Not on that November night, but 31 years ago when I first put on a suit and walked into the Allegheny County Courthouse as a newly licensed CPA. My name is Vernon Aldgate. I'm 63 years old. I spent the better part of 3 decades as a forensic accountant. The kind they call when a business smells rotten but nobody can find the leak yet. I've testified in federal court. I've helped put men in prison who thought their paper trails were clean. I retired 4 years ago, moved to a smaller house in Cranberry Township, Pennsylvania, outside Pittsburgh, and told myself I was done with all of it. I have one son. His name is Miles. He's 34, works in commercial real estate, and 3 years ago he married a woman named Addie, short for Adelaide, who is, without qualification, the finest person I have ever known. Outside of his mother, God rest her. Addie came from modest circumstances. Her father passed when she was 12. Her mother, Yvonne, raised her and her younger brother alone on a school cafeteria supervisor's salary in Altoona. Addie put herself to Penn State on scholarships and loans, graduated with honors, and now works as a pediatric occupational therapist at a clinic in Sorgley. She is patient, funny, perceptive, and she has never once, not once, in the 3 years I've known her, said an unkind word about another person in front of me. Miles' wife's family is a different story. Her in-laws, my son's in-laws, are the Carmichael Fosters. Sterling Carmichael Foster made his money in regional banking, got lucky on some commercial real estate deals in the 90s, and has spent the 20 years since building a reputation as a civic philanthropist. His wife, Renata, sits on the boards of 3 nonprofits and has not, to my knowledge, worked a paying job a single day in her adult life. They live in a 9,000-square-foot colonial in Fox Chapel, host a Thanksgiving dinner every year that gets photographed for their Christmas card, and treat every gathering as an audition for a lifestyle they believe they've already won. Miles fell into their orbit the way young men sometimes do, impressed by the polish of it, the ease, the sense that this family had already figured out how life was supposed to look. I worried about it when they were dating. I said nothing because he was an adult and I trusted his judgment, and I did not want to be the bitter widower father who drove his son away. That was, in retrospect, one of the larger mistakes of my life. The Thanksgiving dinner was Addie's idea. She wanted to try. She was always trying. She'd spent 2 years navigating Renata's comments about her background, Sterling's habit of talking over her at the table, and the general Carmichael Foster posture that Miles had married slightly beneath himself. She kept trying because she loved my son, and because she genuinely believed that families could be repaired if you put in enough patience and good faith. She was 4 months pregnant. Miles had called me the week before and mentioned, carefully, that things had been tense lately. Renata had made some remark at a birthday dinner, something about Addie's mother attending the baby shower, and Addie had finally said something back. Not meanly, just firmly. Miles said Renata had been cold to Addie ever since. I told him to keep an eye on it. I told him family dinners had a way of making things worse when tensions were already running. He said he thought it would be fine. I drove up to Fox Chapel that evening to drop off a bottle of wine I'd promised Sterling weeks earlier, a 2018 Stag's Leap that he'd mentioned admiring. I hadn't planned to stay. I parked in the circular driveway behind a row of other cars, grabbed the bottle from the passenger seat, and walked around the side of the house toward the back entrance, which Sterling had always preferred for informal arrivals. The back of the house faces a flagstone patio. There's a covered pergola at the far end, and in November it's open to the air on 3 sides. Addie was sitting in a wrought iron chair under the pergola. She had her coat on, but it was thin. A peacoat she'd bought in better weather. She was hunched forward with her arms folded across her stomach, the instinctive posture of a pregnant woman keeping herself warm. Her breath was coming out in small clouds. She was not crying. She was very, very still, the way a person gets when they've already used up the crying. Through the French doors, 20 feet away, I could see the dining room. Sterling at the head of the table. Renata laughing at something. Miles's uncle and his wife. Miles's younger sister, Portia, on her phone. The table was fully set. Crystal, candles, the whole production. Nobody was looking out. Nobody had sent a coat. I don't know exactly what happened inside me in that moment. I've thought about it many times since. I was trained professionally to be methodical, to observe before I act, to build a picture before I draw a conclusion. That training kept me calm on the outside. On the inside, something older than training took over. I walked across the patio. Addie looked up when she heard my footsteps, and for a half-second I saw something flash across her face. Embarrassment. She was embarrassed that I had seen her like this. That broke something in me that I don't have a word for. I took off my overcoat and put it around her shoulders without saying anything. I sat down in the chair next to her. "Pop," she said. That's what she called me. Not Vernon, not Mr. Aldgate. "Pop." "I've got nowhere to be," I said. She didn't explain right away. We sat for a minute. I could hear the muffled sounds of laughter from inside. "Renata asked me to step outside," she finally said, "during appetizers. She said I was making things uncomfortable." She paused. I'd asked Miles to say something about the baby shower, about my mom being included in the planning. And Miles said something, and Sterling made a joke of it. And Renata said, she stopped. It doesn't matter what she said. I said something back. And she told me to go get some air, and I went. How long ago was that? She looked at her watch. 40 minutes. 40 minutes. 4 months pregnant. 32 degrees. And my son had not come out. I sat with that for a moment. I looked at the French doors. "Stay here," I said. "Don't go back in yet." "Pop, please don't." "I'm not going to make a scene," I said. And I meant it. I had not survived 30 years in courtrooms and boardrooms by making scenes. I went in through the back door. The dining room conversation paused when I appeared. Sterling looked surprised, then covered it with his host's smile. "Vernon, we didn't know you were joining us." "I was dropping off your wine," I said, setting the stag's leap on the sideboard. I ran into Addie outside. A small silence. "She needed a moment," Renata said. Smooth, practiced, the tone of a woman who had long experience making her cruelty sound like kindnesses. "She needed a coat," I said. "It's 32 degrees. She chose to stay outside. She's 4 months pregnant, and she's been sitting in the cold for 40 minutes. I said it the same way I used to read numbers into a court record. Flat. Factual. Miles. My son lived at me across the table. He looked, I am sorry to say, smaller than I knew him to be. Dad, this is between Addie and... Your pregnant wife is outside in 32-degree weather because she was told to leave the table." I looked at him for 3 full seconds. That is not something that happens in a family I'm part of. Sterling put down his fork. He was not a man accustomed to being addressed plainly in his own home. He had the large, settled confidence of someone who had bought his way out of discomfort for so long he had forgotten it was possible to simply be confronted with it. "Vernon," he said with the particular tone of a man who uses your first name as a warning, "I think you may not have the full picture of what happened this evening." "I have the part of the picture where a pregnant woman is sitting outside alone," I said. "I tend to find that part fairly important. Addie said some things. I don't doubt it. I looked at Renata. What did you say to her? Another small silence. Different quality this time. I simply suggested she take a moment to compose herself, Renata said. In those words? She looked at me with the careful blankness of a woman recalibrating. More or less. And what had she said that required composing? She was being disrespectful. To whom? To me? The warmth dropped out of Renata's voice. Just briefly. In my home, on a holiday. I nodded. I took a breath. I looked around the table. Sterling, Renata, Portia looking at her plate now, the uncle and his wife studying the centerpiece. I'm going to take Addie home, I said. Miles, you should come with us. The silence that followed had texture. I could feel Sterling forming a response, something calibrated to reassert the natural order of his dining room. I think, he said slowly, that if you do that, Vernon, you'll be making a much larger statement than you intend. That's all right, I said. I mean every word of it. Miles came. I'll give him that. He didn't come immediately. There was a moment in the foyer, out of earshot, where he told me I was overreacting, that I didn't understand the history, that Addie had said things too. I listened. Then I told him that whatever Addie had said, she had not said it from a cold patio chair, and that I needed him to make a decision about what kind of husband he intended to be. He went and got Addie. We drove to my house in Cranberry Township. I made tea. Addie sat on my couch, wrapped in a wool blanket, and Miles sat next to her, and eventually she told us what Renata had actually said. Not compose yourself, but a full sentence about how women from certain backgrounds sometimes struggled to understand that gratitude, not demands, was the appropriate posture in a family like theirs. Miles stared at the floor for a long time after she said that. I didn't know she said that, he finally said. I know, Addie said. That was the night things changed. But it was not the end. I went home and I did what I had done for 30 years when something felt wrong. I started paying attention. Sterling Carmichael Foster had a public reputation as a philanthropist. He sat on the advisory board of a regional community development fund, the kind of quasi-public entity that receives both private donations and state grant money. I'd seen his name in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette twice in the past year. Well-regarded, well-connected. I'm a forensic accountant. I know how to read 99. A Form 99 is what nonprofit organizations file with the IRS. It's public record. Anyone can pull one. Most people don't, because they're dense and unglamorous and require a certain kind of patience to interpret. I have spent my career developing exactly that patience. I pulled the 990s for the Carmichael Foster Family Foundation, their private charitable vehicle, going back 5 years. Then I pulled the filings for the Community Development Fund Sterling sat on. Then I made some calls. Not official calls. Retired calls. The calls you make when you know people who know people, and everyone trusts you because you spent 3 decades not misusing that trust. What I found was not a smoking gun. It was something more like a careful arrangement, the kind that sophisticated people construct precisely because it doesn't look like anything at first. Consulting fees paid from the foundation to an LLC whose registered agent traced back to a property management company with ties to Sterling's brother-in-law. Grant distributions from the community fund to projects that happened to sit on parcels Sterling had optioned years before through a separate holding entity. None of it was necessarily illegal. All of it was the kind of thing that, set beside itself, raises questions. I called a former colleague. He'd gone into private practice as a forensic consultant for a law firm that did quite a bit of work with the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office. I explained what I'd found and what I suspected. I told him I wasn't asking for action. I was asking for a second set of eyes. He called me back 4 days later. Vernon, he said, you still have the eye. In January, Addie had a scare. She was 22 weeks and she went into the hospital for elevated blood pressure. They kept her overnight. It was, the doctor said, manageable, but she was going to need reduced stress and careful monitoring for the remainder of the pregnancy. I drove to the hospital the night she was admitted. Miles was there. He looked wrecked, the way young men look when the consequences of their inattention finally arrive somewhere they cannot deny. "I should have come outside sooner," he said while Addie was sleeping. That night at Thanksgiving. "Yes," I said. "I kept thinking if I made a big deal of it, it would just get worse. With them." "She was sitting outside in the cold for 40 minutes, I said. The big deal had already happened. He didn't say anything. "Son," I said, "there are people in this world who interpret your patience as permission. The only thing that changes the equation is making them understand it isn't." He looked at me. "What are you doing, Dad?" "I know you. You're doing something." "I'm paying attention," I said. "That's all I've ever done." Sterling called me in February. He had heard through what channel, I don't know, the world of Pittsburgh civic money is smaller than it looks, that certain questions were being asked about his foundation. He was not panicked. He was too experienced to panic, but he was precise. "I think we should have a conversation," he said. "All right," I said. We met at a coffee shop in Shadyside. He came alone, which told me he'd decided this was a matter for quiet management rather than lawyers. He ordered black coffee and smiled at me across the table with the ease of a man who has never had to apologize for anything in his life. "Vernon, I want to be direct with you." "Please," I said. "I understand you've been making some inquiries about my foundation's financial structure." "I've been reading public documents," I said. "That's legal." "Of course." The smile didn't waver. "I just want to make sure we're approaching this as family." "We're not family," I said. "My son married your daughter-in-law. That's a relationship." "It isn't the same thing." Something shifted behind his eyes. "I think you may be letting one difficult evening color your perception of. Your wife told my daughter-in-law, 4 months pregnant, to sit outside in 32-degree weather," I said, "and nobody brought her a coat for 40 minutes, including my son, which is something he and I have spoken about separately." I folded my hands on the table. "That is not one difficult evening. That is a statement about how your family sees mine." Sterling was quiet for a moment. "What is it you want?" he asked, flat now. The host's charm set aside. "I want Addie treated with basic decency," I said. "That's all I've ever wanted." "That cost you nothing." "And the inquiries?" "I'm a retired forensic accountant," I said. "I read public filings. I have no authority to initiate anything." I paused. "But I do know people who do, and if I continue to see my daughter-in-law treated as an afterthought in her own marriage, I'll keep having conversations with them." It was not a threat. It was an accounting of facts. I had learned over 3 decades that those two things can be identical. Sterling drove home. I finished my coffee. I don't know exactly what happened inside that house after that meeting. What I know is what Miles told me. Over several weeks of phone calls in which he sounded progressively more clear-eyed, that Renata had, for the first time in their marriage, been genuinely shaken. That Sterling had told her things were going to have to change. That Portia had apparently told her mother in a separate conversation that she'd been uncomfortable with how Addie was treated, and had said nothing for too long. I know that in March, Renata drove to Miles and Addie's house in Sewickley and sat in their kitchen for 2 hours. I know that Addie told me afterward that Renata had cried, real crying, not performance, and said that she had built so much of her identity around this idea of what her family was supposed to look like that she hadn't noticed, or hadn't let herself notice, how much damage she was doing. I don't know if that's the beginning of repair, or just a more sophisticated version of the same management. I've been around long enough to know the difference takes time to tell. What I know for certain, Addie's blood pressure stabilized. In April, Miles called me at 6 in the morning. "It's a girl, Dad. I sat down on the edge of my bed in Cranberry Township and I held the phone and I didn't say anything for a moment. "You still there?" Miles said. "I'm here," I said. "Tell me about her." "Her name is Frances Yvonne. The Yvonne is for Addie's mother." They asked me before they announced it whether I thought it was all right to give the middle name to the maternal grandmother when the Carmichael Fosters might have expected a nod in their direction. I said it was more than all right. I said it was exactly right. She was born 7 pounds 4 ounces with a full head of dark hair and a disposition, the nurses said, of startling calm. I held her on the second day in the hospital room while Addie slept and Miles went to get food. I held her the way you hold something you almost lost before you had it, which is to say, carefully, and with the particular gratitude of someone who has learned not to take the ordinary for granted. I thought about my own wife. Miles' mother, Ruth, who died of cancer 11 years ago and who would have walked into that Fox Chapel dining room in November and said in 3 sentences, "Everything it took me all winter to accomplish." Ruth had a gift for plain speech that I always admired and never quite mastered. I like to think she would have approved of how I handled it. Not the confrontation. She would have approved of that too, probably. But more the patience of it. The decision to pay attention rather than react. To let the facts build until they meant something. She used to tell me that the difference between a person with power and a person without it is almost never strength. It's usually just information and the willingness to sit with it long enough. She was right about most things. Miles called me 3 weeks after Frances came home. He asked if he could come over for dinner, just the 2 of us. He drove out to Cranberry Township on a Tuesday evening and I made the pot roast his mother used to make. I've gotten reasonably close over the years, close enough. We ate at the kitchen table the way we used to when he was a teenager, before everything got complicated. "I owe you an apology," he said. "No," I said. "Dad, you owe Addie an apology," I said. "Which I believe you've given. What you owe me is different. You owe me the version of yourself that knows what that night cost." He was quiet for a while. "I was afraid of them," he said, "of disappointing them. I'd spent years. I didn't want to be the person who upset the balance. I thought if I kept everyone calm, it would all just work out." "I know," I said. "I've seen that same thinking in boardrooms, smart people convincing themselves that keeping the peace is the same as making things right." I looked at him. "They're not the same thing. One of them is just postponing the bill." He nodded. "You came outside eventually," I said. "That matters. I came because you made me." "You came," I said. "Give yourself that much." I still read the 990s every year. Old habit. Sterling's Foundation restructured its consulting arrangements in the spring. Subtle changes. The kind you make when you know someone is looking. Nothing was ever filed. No referral was ever made. I did not push for one. What I wanted was not Sterling's ruin. I'm 63 years old, and I have better things to do with whatever time I have than spend it wanting a man's ruin. What I wanted was for my daughter-in-law to be able to walk into a room and know that someone in her corner had enough leverage to make the people on the other side think twice. That's all. Renata came to Frances' baptism in June. She held the baby the way people hold babies when they're trying very hard to be different than they've been, carefully, almost formally, as if aware they're being watched. Which she was. I watched. I watched Addie watch her. I watched Miles watch both of them. At one point, standing near the back of the church reception hall, Renata looked over at me. I don't know what she expected. Satisfaction, maybe. Accusation. I nodded. That was all. She nodded back. Frances is 6 months old now. She has Ruth's eyes. That particular shade of gray-green that my wife had, which I had almost forgotten was a color eyes could actually be. She grabs my finger when I hold her and holds on with that absolute infant grip, no reason to hold, no reason to let go, just holding because holding is the whole of what she knows to do. I drove out to see her last Sunday. Addie was in the kitchen when I arrived. She looked rested, or as rested as a person with a 6-month-old can look. Miles was on the back porch assembling something, some piece of outdoor furniture that would probably take the rest of the afternoon. Addie handed Francis to me and poured us both coffee without asking how I took it. She already knows, and we sat at the kitchen table and talked about nothing in particular. The baby, the clinic, a show she'd been watching, normal things, ordinary things. At some point, she put her hand on my arm. "I never properly thanked you," she said. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to," she said. "I want to." She looked at me with the directness she's always had, the quality that I think unnerved the Carmichael Fosters most. She looks at you like she's not afraid of what she might see. You didn't make a scene. You didn't make it about you. You stayed. And then you did what needed doing. "That's all it ever takes," I said. She shook her head, smiling. "You know that's not true." "No," I agreed. "It's not. But it's a better story that way." She laughed. Francis, in my arms, grabbed my finger again. Outside, Miles said something under his breath at whatever furniture he was assembling, and Addie looked toward the porch and smiled the way she smiles when he doesn't know she's watching, with the particular fullness of someone who has decided, against certain evidence, to stay. I watched her. I thought about November, about the flagstone patio and the cold air and the thin peacoat in the breath in small clouds in 40 minutes. Then I looked down at Frances, and she looked back at me with Ruth's gray-green eyes, and the whole weight of November lifted, quietly, the way it does when something good finally arrives to replace what you were afraid you'd lost. I held on. I thought a lot about what actually changed things. Not the meeting in Shadyside, not the 990s, not even the night I walked across that flagstone patio and put my coat around Addie's shoulders. What changed things was the decision, made quietly, before any of that, to pay attention instead of look away. That's the part nobody tells you about getting older. When you're young, you think power is loud. You think justice announces itself. You think the moment you stand up for someone will feel like a moment, dramatic, clear, scoring some kind of point. Then you get to my age, and you realize that most of the real work happens in the spaces between the moments, in the reading, the listening, the willingness to sit with what you know until you understand what it means. I spent 30 years doing that professionally. Turns out it translates. What happened to Addie on that November night didn't happen because Sterling and Renata were uniquely evil people. It happened because they had never once been made to experience a consequence. Every sharp comment, every calculated exclusion, every quiet signal that she wasn't quite right for their family, all of it had gone unanswered for years, and in the absence of any answer, they concluded there wouldn't be one. That's not cruelty, that's just arithmetic. People expand into the space they're given. The same arithmetic applies in reverse. When you make it clear, calmly, specifically, without theater, that the space has limits, the expansion stops. It doesn't always produce remorse. Sometimes it just produces calculation, a reassessment of what's safe. That's enough. You don't need someone to feel sorry. You need them to stop. Miles had to learn his own version of this. He's a good man. I want to be clear about that. But he had spent years confusing conflict avoidance with kindness. He thought that not making waves was the same as keeping the peace. What he was actually doing was handing the people with bad intentions a quieter room to work in. The night I looked at him across that table and said, "Your pregnant wife is outside in 32-degree weather," I wasn't trying to shame him. I was trying to give him information he already had but hadn't let himself fully receive. He received it. Eventually. That's the part that matters. There's a version of this story where I blow up that Thanksgiving dinner, say everything I'm thinking, and make it about my anger. I've seen that version play out in other families. The confrontation happens, The lines get drawn, and everyone retreats permanently to their corners. Addie would still be sidelined. Miles would be caught between. Frances would grow up in a family that had broken along fault lines nobody bothered to repair. I didn't want that story, so I told the other one instead. I told it with patience, with documents, with one quiet meeting over black coffee, and with the particular credibility that comes from having spent a career being right about things that matter. Frances is 6 months old. She has her grandmother's eyes. She grabs my finger and holds on. That is the whole answer to every question about whether it was worth it. If I could say one thing to anyone watching, anyone who is sitting across from a situation that feels too large, too entrenched, too protected by money or reputation or family loyalty to ever really change, it's this: information and patience are a longer lever than most people give them credit for. You don't have to be louder than the people doing harm. You just have to be more careful, more thorough, and more willing to stay in the room. They are counting on you to get tired and go home. Don't go home.